Hi everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here. I'm in a process of still getting over a little bit of a bug, so my voice is a little bit scratchy, but I dived into a new story that I hadn't heard about until just recently when I started researching it. In my last video, I discussed the Lava Lake murders of 3 men who had been seemingly led from a cabin in Central Oregon, brutally murdered, hole cut in the ice. They were thrown in the icy waters of Lava Lake out there. And while I was looking up information about that infamous case from way back in the 1920s, I found an article that was discussing two, as it was considered, unsolved brutal crimes that had happened kind of in the Bend area. The Lava Lakes murder was, I want to say, a little bit southwest of where Bend is, and the story I'm going to talk about in this video actually took place really close to Redmond, Oregon, so a little bit north of Bend, but still in Central Oregon, kind of out in the rural sticks. And this story really drew me in, and what first got me was when I was reading that article that talked about these two cases, and I knew that the Lava Lakes case was a murder, and so I already had kind of the sense of, unsolved crime, murder in my head, and I started reading details about this other case from 1977 that happened in Klein Falls State Park, just west of Redmond. And as I started reading the details about it, I thought I was reading the details of a double homicide. It astonished me to find out as I was reading that not one but both victims of this case I'm going to talk about somehow survived this brutal attack. As I started reading the details, I was so convinced that this was going to be a double murder story that as I was starting to take notes on the case, I literally wrote unsolved 1997 double, and can't really see it. Hold on. I actually wrote double murder, and then as I read, I actually had to scratch out murder and write attack because I was so convinced there's no way that anybody could have survived this, much less both people who were involved. But fortunately, this is not a story about murder, but rather a story about an attempted murder.
Steve the Amateur Historian.
So it's June 22nd, 1977. 2 Yale college students, Avra Goldman and Terry Jantz, were taking on a rather serious undertaking. There had recently been a trail that had been essentially made that spanned all across the country. I think it was called like the Transcontinental Trail. Don't hold me to that. And they decided, a lot of people were, it was brand new, and it was kind of done in relation to, it seems, the bicentennial 1976. So there was kind of a bicentennial connection to it. And a lot of people were taking these treks on bicycle and covering the whole trail from one coast to the other pretty much. And these 2 young women, for their summer off for school, decided to do that. And they had actually gone the full length of the trail, which ended in Astoria, Oregon, which is in the northwest corner of the state and were starting to make their way back east. And that's where this story picks up. It's June 22nd, 1977. They've made it back to the vicinity of Central Oregon, more specifically Klein Falls State Park near Redmond, Oregon. And as the story goes, Terry was ready to settle in for the day. It was presumably getting dark out. Avra was kind of wanted to keep going, but they ultimately decided to stop at this place for the night to set up their tent and sleep and probably get out early, continuing their ride home the following day. And it gets to be approximately 11:30 p.m. at night. They are, according to the sources I've seen, they're asleep by this point in their tent. And they're awakened by the sound of a really loud truck that's getting louder and louder and louder. And it seems next thing you know, suddenly this truck has crashed into their tent, run the tent right over. And it's actually pinned Terry to the ground, severely injured her. It caused all sorts of torso and arm injuries. I even think one of her legs was broken. And just as soon as a truck runs over your tent, you think that's dangerous enough. And she's kind of thinking, oh my God, what kind of drunk teens did this? Back your truck up. You just ran into our tent and ran us over. It turned out to not be just a couple of partying teenagers, because next thing you know, whoever's operating the vehicle gets out of the truck. He has an axe, or at least a hatchet, in his hand, and he goes up to Avra and begins to strike her repeatedly, hits her at least 6 times in the head with this hatchet. Terry, watches this happen in probably just unbearable, indescribable fear. And after just attacking Avra with this axe, he turns to Terry, who's pinned down by his truck. She can't just get up and run away. And by her description, I've actually watched her on video describe this. He turns over her and he's like getting the axe ready, but he's like slowly moving it down towards her. It's almost like when you're doing a practice swing and you kind of are going like this. And she just, does, what else can you do in that scenario but pleads for her life. Please take whatever you want, just please go away, please, leave us. And he makes contact with her with his axe. And then for whatever reason, I don't know if her words got through to him or if something snapped at his mind and he realized, what the hell am I doing? But he pulled the axe back. Next thing you know, he hops back into his truck and speeds away. For whatever reason, that is how the incident ended. And both women, understandably, are severely injured in this instance. Avra is predominantly, trauma to the head from the contact of the axe. She actually underwent a 9-hour surgery to her head and managed to survive. She was at least partially blind from the experience, and from a criminal investigation status, she's has no memory of this attack, so she can't help authorities with any description of the vehicle or the man that attacked him, or what kind of an axe it was, or anything like that. Terry, on the other hand, remembers events pretty well, and it's remarkable that she was, despite horrible damage to her legs, shoulders and arms both broken, just battered, she was able to stumble to her feet and wave down a vehicle that was passing by. And fortunately, there were people there that were able to help her and rush to the scene where Avra was still at. And Terry obviously also was able to recover from her injuries. And the unfortunate thing is she got a view of the man who attacked him, but she said she could never quite make out the guy's face. She was able to make out pretty much, his torso down, and that he was kind of a thin, fit individual that was dressed very much like how a cowboy would dress, you know, kind of a, I mean, not necessarily this stylish, but, you know, kind of a buttoned up shirt tucked into his pants, the belt with the big kind of, you know, circular, ovular belt buckle. So that was really all she could identify the man. So, you know, they couldn't really get a view of the truck. Like, this was a crime that was destined to go unsolved because you don't have the face of the guy, you don't have a vehicle identification. And to this day, it is still regarded as an unsolved, attempted murder. But, like, for instance, the Lava Lake murders, there's someone that everyone is pretty sure is the suspect. That is very much the case in this story. And like so many cases, there were other possible suspects. There was one guy who actually was a convicted child molester and murderer. He had actually murdered a 5-year-old child and fashioned the child's head into, I want to say, a candle holder. So people thought pretty quickly, you know, if a guy's capable of that, he's capable of just about anything. But it was established pretty quickly that that guy was not the assailant, but rather there was somebody else, a local to the Redmond area, that even in the immediate aftermath of this case, and, you know, there's no real suspects, the locals, it was kind of a spoken but unspoken understanding that everyone in town kind of had a general idea of who this crazy assailant actually was. But before I go into that specific suspect, I just want to talk and almost kind of analyze and brainstorm this crime because it's such a bizarre case. And there was kind of this just strange aura that they were being watched, was kind of the vibe they felt. I want to say she described it as almost like an animal instinct of knowing there was danger around. And it's also known that after Terry flagged down these passers-by in their vehicle and they were attending to kind of the crime area, they saw a vehicle in the distance whose lights suddenly turned on and they thought, you know, oh no, what if that's the attacker? What if he's come back for more? But for whatever reason, the car just turned and took off, which they thought was kind of suspicious. You think you flash your lights on a group of people who are clearly in a frantic situation, you think they would maybe approach and see if they could help, but the vehicle just turned and left. And it's kind of been left to consideration that maybe that was the killer lingering around or coming back for a second glance or who knows, and then speeding off into the darkness. And it's very interesting to consider the idea that maybe Avra and Terry were being watched. It's so strange because it's such a sudden and crazy and almost driven act of violence. The way it's described is this guy just pulls down on his truck and just beelines it right towards their tent. He jumps a curve. He has to weave between park benches. He actually struck a park bench. There's crime scene photos that show a piece of park bench chipped away that presumably his truck clipped, and he just rams into the tent and comes to a stop and gets out with an axe and attacks the people in there. It's so bizarre because you'd think, okay, if these women were locals that have a reputation there and they know people and they you know, over the course of time of living there, they did something that pissed off the wrong guy, and it gets around that they're going to go down to this, you know, park and camp for the night. He knows they're going to be there. They're alone. It's dark. It's an opportunity to get revenge. But these two girls were not locals. These girls were, if I'm getting it right, Terry was originally from Illinois, and Avra was from Massachusetts, and they went to school at Yale. These were Eastern United States young women. They were only in Oregon because they were on a bike trip. So these were not locals. They hadn't even been in the area long enough to really get to know anybody, much less piss somebody off to the point that they would take that drastic an action. You think This is the 70s. The park is probably pitch black at this point. It's pushing midnight. Um, Aver and Terry are both reportedly asleep, so it's not like they would have like a light on in their tent. Their tent should be dark too. And this guy just goes down, goes down in the darkness, weaves around, sees a tent probably lit up by his headlights, and speeds towards him and brutally attacks him. I mean, what's the motivation there? These women weren't even down long enough, again, to really piss anybody off. So, who would be driven that much to go to a park where they would even, you wouldn't even know if anybody's going to be there unless potentially he was watching them. And I think whoever did this, and I tend to agree it's probably the suspect that I'm going to begin discussing soon. And Terry Jentz also thinks that he is the man that attacked them. Now, if we fast forward a little ways, it's many years later, it's 1992, and Terry Gents, who by her own account had been really kind of emotionally traumatized by this incident. She said that she had this, kind of anger that she was just holding in inside her, and it led to these kind of strange fears and phobias. And finally, by 1992, it's 15 years later, she decided to dive into this case. It's still a cold case. They still don't really have a solid suspect, even though Dick Dam, which that's how I'm going to continue to refer to him, because it's such a dumb name, and this guy's a real scumbag, as you will see. And it's interesting because I read a quote from Terry Jantz's father, where essentially he said after they recovered from their injuries, he essentially said, which is totally understandable from a father's perspective, that he would never let her return to Oregon, that, the streets of New York and Chicago are safer than Oregon, apparently. So there's kind of some, irony to that, because you think, walking around the streets of the big city, you can get mugged, assaulted, any number of things can happen. But here we are in 1992, and Terry Gents goes against her father's wishes, and for the first time since the attack, she returns to Redmond. She's got a camera to take, visuals. She wants to talk to anybody in Redmond who will listen to her. She goes, dives in to any of the records on the case, and she actually, interestingly enough, discovers that a lot of the files on this case have miraculously disappeared, which for some reason, with really big cases, some unsolved ones, happens way too often. But there were crime scene photos that had gone missing, lots of documents had gone missing, physical evidence had gone missing. And, that's a real serious roadblock when you're trying to solve a case that's already gone cold. But as she dived head on into this case, one of the people that she was able to get in touch with was a woman named Janie Fraley. I hope I'm saying that name right. She was, at the time of these attacks, she was Dick Dam's girlfriend. And he had been severely abusive to her, both, mentally and physically, ongoing throughout the whole course of their relationship. And it was discovered, primarily through Jens delving back into this, that the day after her attack, which was June 22nd, 1977, is June 23rd, 1977. And for whatever reasons brought it about, Dam begins to violently attack Janie. He beats her, he's stomping her. The only reason she's able to get away with her life is she dives into a nearby waterway and just swims away for her life while he's reportedly yelling, "I'm gonna kill you," to her, and she barely gets away. And she reports this, and apparently the police don't do anything. The attitude was, they were underage, they were just seemingly having a lover's quarrel, and it's, a rural Oregon town, and we just sweep that stuff under the rug, apparently. Well, more than just the fact that through his relationship we can see Dick Dam was a real scumbag with a penchant for abuse to a level beyond your average douchebag boyfriend. A lot more interesting information would come out in regards to this guy in relation to the attack. One of the only things that the police really had to go on when they started investigating this case was the tire tread left behind by the truck as it, jumped the curb and left tracks in the, grass at the park. And one thing they noticed was at least two of the tires were balding on the truck. It seemed like the tires on the truck that was being used really needed replacing. Well, Janie would come out and say that not too long after these attacks happened, like within days, she noticed that Dick Dam, who drove a truck, had replaced some of the tires on his truck, almost as though they were going balding and needed to be replaced. Coincidence? Well, something else she also noted, around the time that he changed his tires, not too long after the crime happens, there was a toolbox that Dam kept in his truck, always kept it in there. And according to Janie, personally, he kept a hatchet in there. And then suddenly, right after these attacks happen, that toolbox disappears from the truck. It just vanishes forever. So we're talking some real serious circumstantial evidence here, no matter which way you look at it. And Janie actually went to the site where the attacks happened, and she looked at the tread that was left herself and said personally that it matched with the tread that was on Dick's tires, the ones he had before he replaced them. So either she's putting him at the scene of the crime, or there was randomly some other guy in town who had the exact same type of tires who, what are the odds is what I'm getting at. And what's really interesting is Dick was apparently well aware that everybody was pointing their fingers at him as, hey, he probably did it. And he openly acknowledged it. There was a guy named Pat Daly who would hire him for various, odd jobs and whatnot. And he said that Dick would ceaselessly talk about the crime like he was obsessed with it while always making sure to deny his involvement. And he's always maintained that he wasn't involved, even though the statute of limitation on this case expired in 1980. So he could literally go on YouTube like I am right now and be like, I did it. I ran over those girls and attacked them with a hatchet. And by law, the authorities couldn't do anything. But apparently to this day, the guy denies his involvement. But why is the guy so fixated on the case? It's very interesting. There were reports that, 1992 is when Terry Jentz got back into this case. And in 2006, she released a book on the case. And apparently, when it came out that she had done a book on this case, Dick Dam, as it seems like he was ceaselessly throughout his life, he was in jail. And the news got to him that she had written a book on this case, and he apparently went out of his mind, off the walls, ballistic. It got to the point where fellow jail inmates, fellow criminals, were actually feared for their safety because he went so insane. And I'm still thinking, if you're totally innocent, why does this bother you so much? I can understand thinking, great, she wrote a book. She's going to spend a bunch of time talking about how I did it. And I can understand maybe being like, damn it, that bitch is going to, dude, she's going to talk about me. I understand being annoyed and frustrated. But getting to the point that you're making jail inmates fearful for their safety in jail, that's on a whole other level of being problematic. So there is so much. Again, a lot of it is circumstantial, and unfortunately, it comes down to the fact that this information was known way back then, and it seems the authorities just kind of didn't really pursue the Dick Dam angle as possibly being the killer. And now a lot of the evidence seems to have disappeared. So many years have passed, it's not like they're going to find the tires that were on the truck. They probably couldn't even find the truck now if they wanted to. It's probably been ripped into pieces or in a wrecking yard somewhere at this point. Like, there's so little you can do without just grilling Dick Dam to no end or hoping he'll confess. And the case was actually opened in 1995. It was reopened. And the detective who looked into it said that they felt they could get an indictment on Dam with what they now knew, but with statute of limitation ending in 1980, that's not a possibility, but it's still very powerful words. We could get an indictment on this guy if we had the possibility to do that. And when that came around, they started talking to this guy again, and they wanted him to take a polygraph test, and he took one. And the first one was deemed inconclusive, so he takes a second one. And on that one, they did deem that a lot of his answers were deceptive. However, the second test came under scrutiny because this guy is such a damn screw up. Apparently, and maybe he probably did this on purpose, Dick Dam was on methamphetamines when he took his second test. So that called that one into question, but still the results were sent to a lab for analysis in Salem. And the conclusions reached, beyond all other opinions, analysis, whatnot, they deemed that by looking at the results of both polygraph tests, that Dick Dam was being deceptive in both. That was their final conclusions. So, in being given a lie detector test, I know lie detector tests are only so reliable, but the fact that the guy took two and an analysis lab found that both cases they had reason enough to come out with the final conclusion he was deceptive in both, that means they're asking this guy the same questions more than once. Were you involved in this crime? Was that your truck that did it? Did you own a hatchet? Whatever questions they asked, did you own a hatchet? Was it a hatchet that you owned that was used to attack these women? Whatever questions regarding the crime, this guy was deemed to answer deceptively. So, how much more information do you need? How much more evidence do you need before you start saying, yeah, we're pretty sure this is the guy? All we need now is a confession from the son of a bitch. And I saved this for the end because it's the least valid piece of information, but I mean, if you want any more evidence that this guy was involved, there was a story that went around, and I don't know if it really led to anything. It may have just been a rumor. It may have been people trying to pin it on him. I don't know. But right after the attacks happened, Dick Dam hasn't even really been, people are talking, but he hasn't really come to law enforcement's attention that much. And it has to be chalked up to a rumor. I can't emphasize that enough. I don't know how valid this story is, so take it with a grain of salt. But it did come out, and it kind of was going around town, that a hatchet had been found discarded in a body of water, I'm assuming in a river. Possibly, the river that ran right next to Klein Falls State Park, that apparently the initials DD had been carved into the handle. Of course, Richard Dam goes by Dick Dam. Dick Dam, initials DD. So that is a story that came out. I don't know how valid that story is. I read that in a source. But it's still kind of interesting. It may be true, it may be nonsense. People making light of a horrible tragedy. But, I was interested in, just the fact that I went into this thinking I was going to be reading about an unsolved hatchet murder and then discovering that both these women somehow miraculously survived. That was enough to really make me want to do a video about this story. But then when I read about Terry Jentz and how she'd, the struggles that she'd had for so many years after this attack, and on the flip side, the light warming story of Avril Goldman, who, despite, suffering, loss of eyesight, this trauma that she received, she apparently has gone on to, according to Terry, to have a pretty successful life, which is fantastic. But to see that Terry was able to address her demons that she was facing by diving headlong back into this crime, an unsolved crime that was perpetrated against her directly. And that, since 1992, for over 25 years, she's been, she has fought and dug to try to find a resolution to this crime. And it seems pretty clear that she thinks Dick Dam was the person that perpetrated this random, the most random act of violence you can imagine, since it was, stranger on stranger violence. And, just the fact that they were in a secluded park, Nobody who wasn't watching them would even know they were there, and that this guy in the dead of night plows, through the park and runs him over, then jumps out and attacks him with a hatchet. It's one of the most bizarre cases of violence I've ever heard in my life, and I've been, looking up cases of violence and brutality most of my life. It's a disturbing side of humanity, but it's one that I think needs to be analyzed and understood the best that it possibly can. If nothing more, to help prevent things like this from happening in the future by noticing the signs in people that are capable of, out of nowhere, ramming their truck into a tent with two young women and then hatcheting them almost to death. This Dick Dam guy has an endless string of criminal offenses. This is a real messed up guy, and Terry even met him in person once and said that he really bore a resemblance to the type that this guy was. He even was still kind of dressed in that kind of cowboy look all these many years later. So yeah, anybody who's really looked into it is about 90%, 90+% sure that this was the guy that did it. And unfortunately, I can't say the guy's roamed free ever since, because the guy keeps breaking the law and keeps at least getting busted for other offenses he's engaged in. And the guy's only about 58, 59 years old right now. He's maybe got a lot of time left, and maybe someday he'll finally come out and confess if he is this attacker, attempted murderer. Time can only tell. But as I'm sure you can tell, I felt really driven to bring you this story because of the wildness and the random brutality of it all, but then the fact that the victims were able to come away. I know a lot of these stories I tell are stories of murder, where the victims don't walk away with their lives. But every now and then you gotta tell one where the victims come away, and in the end the victims win, no matter what way you look at it. If Dick Dam is the assailant, he's a guy with a endless rap sheet who's going to spend the better part, if not most, of the rest of his life behind bars. And these two young women who almost died, and probably should have, considering the brutality of it all, probably should have died, and they have forged lives for themselves here on into the future. And that, again, if anything can be taken away from this crime, is truly wonderful. And that is the story of the attempted double homicide via axe that happened out in Central Oregon. And that all said, guys, that took a bit out of me. But as always, remember, I gotta do this at the end of every video, I just do. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if you like what I'm doing, want to help my channel grow. And always remember to hit up my Patreon if you want to help me financially. The link is in the description below. And it's really just as simple as that, guys. And again, thank you for watching. This is definitely a story that deserves exposure for all that it's come to in the, decades since it's occurred, 41 years ago. 41 and a half years ago, if you want to get down to it, this crime took place. And till next time, guys, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you next time.